My suitcase wasn't by the door, and there was no dramatic warning before Claire decided I didn't belong beside her. It happened over a place card. I had driven nearly 2 hours from the farm to the private dining room Daniel had reserved for the engagement dinner, after spending most of the afternoon helping replace a cracked irrigation fitting before it flooded the lower field. I had showered, changed into a clean button-down shirt, and scrubbed my hands twice. But years of sun and work do not disappear because somebody books a room with white tablecloths. Daniel saw me first. "Dad." He crossed the room smiling and hugged me before I could even set down my jacket. Then he introduced me to Claire's parents and the relatives already gathered around the table. Everyone was polite enough. Claire was polite too, at first. Then she looked at the seating cards. Mine was beside hers. I watched her expression change before she noticed I was watching. She leaned toward the server and said something too quietly for me to catch. The server began moving 2 place cards. Daniel noticed. "What are you doing?" Claire smiled quickly. "Nothing. I just thought the parents might be more comfortable grouped differently." Daniel glanced at the table. "Dad's already beside you." "I know. So why move him?" There was a pause. Claire looked at me, then at the people around us. Her voice dropped, but not enough. "Daniel, I don't want to spend my engagement dinner sitting beside a poor farmer." The room went still. Not silent exactly. I could hear silverware being set down somewhere outside the room and the low hum of the air conditioner. But at our table, nobody moved. Claire's mother stared at her. Her father looked down. Daniel did not say anything for several seconds. I had been insulted before. Farmers get underestimated all the time. Usually it rolls off. This was different because she was going to marry my son. I picked up my jacket. "Daniel, we can talk tomorrow." "Dad, wait." I looked at him. He wasn't angry in the way I expected. He looked disappointed, and somehow that was heavier. "5 minutes," he said. "Please." I stayed where I was. Claire started. "Thomas," I didn't. "Mean." Daniel lifted one hand. Not sharply, just enough to stop her. Then he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. I had never seen it before. He placed it on the table in front of Claire. Her name wasn't on it. Mine was. Daniel looked at her, then at me. "Before Dad leaves," he said quietly, "you should read what I was going to give him tonight." Claire stared at the envelope without touching it. "What is this?" she asked. Daniel kept his eyes on her. "Open it." I stepped closer to the table. "Daniel, whatever that is, tonight isn't the time." "It was supposed to be the time, Dad." That answer stopped me. Claire finally picked up the envelope, but she didn't open it yet. Instead, she looked at me as though she were trying to understand how the man standing in front of her could possibly be connected to whatever Daniel had prepared. I knew what she saw. My truck outside was 12 years old. The farmhouse had needed a new porch railing for longer than I cared to admit. I repaired equipment when repairing made sense and replaced it only when it didn't. Since Margaret died, I had kept the farm running the same way we always had. Carefully, season by season, spending what the land could support. There was nothing glamorous about it. I had never pretended otherwise. I knew crop schedules, equipment costs, loan payments, land records, and exactly how long a bad harvest could follow you into the next good one. None of that looked impressive across a table set with crystal glasses. Claire had noticed those differences before. A month earlier, while discussing the wedding, she had asked Daniel whether I would feel comfortable at the venue they were considering. Another time, she suggested he buy me something presentable for the ceremony. She had once sounded genuinely surprised when I mentioned that I rarely traveled, immediately assuming money was the reason. I had let those comments pass. Daniel loved her, and I had no interest in becoming the father who searched every sentence his future daughter-in-law spoke for evidence against her. But now those little moments felt different. Claire's mother finally broke the silence. "Claire, you owe Thomas an apology." "I know." Claire looked around the table, her face flushed. "I handled this badly. I only thought everyone would be more comfortable if the seating were rearranged." Daniel glanced at the untouched chair beside her. "Who was uncomfortable?" "That's not what I meant. Dad wasn't uncomfortable." Claire pressed her lips together. "Daniel, please. I'm asking a simple question. Who were you trying to make comfortable?" She looked toward me, then away. There was no answer that helped her. I didn't enjoy watching her struggle. Whatever she had said, I still knew this was the woman my son had planned to marry. "You've made your point," I told Daniel. "Let it go for tonight." He shook his head. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Make things easier for me by pretending they didn't cost you anything." The words landed strangely. For years, Margaret and I had agreed on one thing. Whatever choices we made for Daniel were ours. He was never supposed to carry them around like a debt. I looked at the envelope again. Claire seemed to notice my confusion. You don't know what's in this? No, that finally made her open it. She slid out several neatly arranged pages and looked at the first one. Her embarrassment gave way to puzzlement. She turned to the second page, then back to the first. Daniel. He said nothing. Claire lowered the papers enough to look directly at him. Why is your name on all these payments? Claire looked down again, tracing one of the lines with her finger. These are tuition payments. Some of them, Daniel said. And housing. She turned another page. But you told me you had scholarships. I did. And you worked. I did that too. Claire frowned. Then where did these come from? I knew before Daniel answered, and suddenly I understood enough of the envelope to want it closed. Daniel. He looked at me. Dad, she asked. That doesn't mean this belongs at this table. Maybe it should have belonged at our table a long time ago. I shook my head. Your mother and I made our choices. You don't owe anybody an explanation for them. That's exactly what you always say. He turned back to Claire. The scholarships helped. My jobs helped. They didn't cover everything. Claire looked at me. I wished she wouldn't. There are sacrifices that feel honorable only when nobody is standing around admiring them. Margaret and I had never thought of those payments as proof of anything. They were bills that had to be paid. During Daniel's second year, a weak harvest had cut deeper into our income than we expected. The following season was better, but by then we were catching up on fertilizer, equipment maintenance, and the ordinary expenses that do not wait for a farm to recover. Daniel had called one evening worried about housing and whether he should take another job. Margaret listened, asked him about his classes, and told him to concentrate on finishing the semester. Afterward, she and I sat at the kitchen table with the farm accounts spread between us. We moved what we could. We delayed what could wait. And the payment went out. Daniel tapped one of the records. I found these when I was helping Dad sort paperwork after that insurance issue at the farm. I looked at him. You weren't supposed to be digging through 20-year-old records. For the first time that evening, the corner of his mouth almost moved. You gave me 3 boxes and told me to figure out what could be shredded. That sounded like me. Claire was still reading. How many years did they do this? Claire, I said, don't turn this into something it wasn't. Daniel earned scholarships. He worked hard. He graduated because he did the work. His mother and I covered gaps when there were gaps. But you were struggling. Sometimes. And he didn't know? I looked at Daniel before answering. He knew farming wasn't making us rich. He didn't know every number. Why not? That question was easier. Because helping your child isn't the same as giving him an invoice afterward. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. The room had changed. Nobody was looking at my shirt or my hands anymore. I didn't take satisfaction in that. If anything, I felt Margaret's absence more sharply than I had when I walked in. She had been better at explaining why we kept certain burdens between ourselves. Claire slowly returned the first pages to the stack. Then she noticed another document underneath them, thicker than the payment records. She pulled it free. I recognized the bank's old letterhead immediately. My stomach tightened. Claire read the date, then looked at Daniel. This was your final year. He nodded. Her eyes moved to the heading on the page. Thomas, she said carefully, why is this a refinancing agreement for the farm? For a moment, nobody spoke. I could have given Claire the short answer, and probably should have. Instead, I looked at the date she was pointing to and remembered exactly where Margaret and I had been when we signed those papers. Because we refinanced part of it, I said. Claire stared at me. For Daniel? Not exactly. The farm already had expenses. But his final year was part of the reason we needed room. Daniel leaned forward. My funding changed that year. I nodded. One portion of your scholarship didn't come through the way we expected. You were close enough to graduation that quitting made no sense. I could have taken a year off. Your mother considered that a terrible idea. Despite everything, Daniel smiled faintly. That sounds like Mom. It did. Margaret had sat across from me at our kitchen table with the tuition deadline written on a yellow notepad and said, we didn't get him this far so he can come home because one number changed. It wasn't courage in the dramatic sense. We had land, machinery, bills, and a son with 1 year left. We made a decision, but it was a risk. A farm does not stop needing money because you borrowed against it. That same year, a piece of equipment needed more work than expected. We repaired only what was necessary and postponed replacing it. Claire's father had been silent until then. He held out his hand. May I? Claire passed him the refinancing agreement. He read it, then asked for the payment records underneath. I watched his eyes move between the dates. This transfer, he said, tapping one line, was shortly after the refinancing closed. Yes, I said. He checked another page. And before the tuition deadline, a few days before, he leaned back slowly and returned the papers to Claire. Then these aren't just old farm documents. The timing matters. Claire looked at him. Dad, I'm not taking sides. I'm telling you what the paperwork shows. That was the first moment someone besides Daniel and me confirmed what those pages meant. I wished it made me feel vindicated. It didn't. Claire's embarrassment hardened into defensiveness. But Daniel never told me any of this. How was I supposed to know? Daniel answered immediately. You weren't. She blinked. What? You couldn't have known about the refinancing. I didn't know about it myself until recently. Some tension left her shoulders, as though she thought he had finally offered her a way out. Exactly. Daniel shook his head. That's not the same as saying you needed to know. I don't understand. He pointed toward the chair beside her. You knew he was my father. That should have been enough to sit next to him. Claire looked at the empty chair. This time she had nothing ready to say. I felt the evening tipping somewhere I did not want it to go. Daniel was supposed to be celebrating an engagement, not putting his future wife on trial over decisions Margaret and I had made years ago. Son, I said, she understands. Daniel looked at me. Does she? I didn't answer. He reached toward the papers, but instead of taking them away, he separated the refinancing agreement from the rest. And this isn't why I brought the envelope. Daniel reached deeper into the envelope and pulled out a folded sheet of paper I recognized before he opened it. Not because I remembered the exact page, but because I knew Margaret's handwriting from across a room. Her capital letters always leaned slightly forward, as if even her words were in a hurry to get somewhere. Where did you find that? I asked. In the same box. Daniel. He stopped unfolding it. You've read it. Yes. Something tightened in my chest. Margaret had been gone 6 years. I had kept boxes of her papers because deciding what mattered and what didn't had always felt harder than simply putting them away. Was it addressed to you? My name is at the top. Then maybe it was meant for you. She never sent it. Claire watched us without speaking. The financial records had embarrassed her. This was different. This belonged to a part of our family that had existed long before she entered it. Daniel looked at me. I don't have to read any of it. I wanted to tell him not to. Margaret had never believed love needed witnesses. Neither had I. But I also knew Daniel well enough to see that whatever was on that page had changed the way he understood those old records. If I stopped him now simply because hearing it would hurt, I would be doing exactly what I had done with the money, deciding for him which truths he was allowed to carry. Not all of it, I said. Only what matters here. Daniel nodded. He didn't read the letter word for word. He told us what Margaret had written. She had worried Daniel might eventually discover how close some of those years had been financially. She didn't want him coming home because he felt guilty. She wanted him to finish what he had started, build his own life, and understand that whatever his parents chose to give him was given freely. Then Daniel paused. His voice changed when he continued. Margaret had written that one day he might have a family of his own, and when that happened, she hoped he surrounded himself with people who understood that you could not measure a person by the things they owned. The sentence did not predict Claire. Margaret had never met her. It was simply the kind of thing she believed after a lifetime of watching people mistake a modest life for a failed one. That made hearing it harder, not easier. Claire lowered her eyes. Her father looked away. I pictured Margaret at our kitchen desk, probably writing after Daniel had called from school, putting thoughts on paper she eventually decided he didn't need. She should have sent it, Daniel said. No, I replied. Your mother probably decided she'd already said what she needed to say. He folded the page carefully. I didn't know any of this, Dad. You weren't meant to. That's what you keep saying. Because it's true. And you think that makes it easier? I had no good answer. For years I had believed protecting him from the cost was part of the gift. Standing there, I began to understand that Daniel might see it differently. Claire looked from him to me. So you brought all of this tonight because you were going to tell Thomas you found out? Daniel nodded. Partly. I frowned. Partly. He gathered the tuition records, the refinancing agreement, and Margaret's letter into one stack. This envelope existed before anything happened tonight. I wasn't planning to embarrass Claire with it. I was going to give it to you after dinner. That changed the room again. Until then, The envelope had looked like Daniel's answer to an insult. It wasn't. He had walked into the restaurant already carrying it. Why? I asked. Daniel reached back into the envelope and removed one final page. Unlike Margaret's letter or the old bank records, the paper was new. He held it for a second without handing it to me. Then he looked directly at me. "There's one more page," he said. "That part is mine." Daniel slid the new page across the table toward me. I didn't pick it up immediately. The first thing I saw was a list of dates and amounts arranged in neat columns, followed by a section about equipment costs. "What is this?" I asked. "A proposal," Daniel said. "For what?" "For me to start carrying part of what's left." I looked at him. "No, Dad, read it first." "I don't need to." He gave a tired little smile. "I knew you'd say that." The page laid out monthly contributions toward the remaining balance connected to the farm refinancing, along with a separate amount Daniel wanted to put toward replacing equipment I had kept repairing instead of replacing. Nothing on the page would transform the farm overnight. Daniel wasn't offering to buy me a new life. He had calculated something he could realistically manage without pretending money had no limits. That almost made it harder to refuse. "You are not paying me back for raising you," I said. "I know. Your mother would hate this. Mom would hate me calling it repayment. So I'm not." He tapped the page. "I'm sharing a burden I didn't know existed. It was our burden. And you decided that for me." His voice wasn't angry. That was what made me listen. "You and Mom gave me the freedom to finish school without feeling responsible for what it cost you. I understand why. But now I'm an adult, Dad. I get to decide what I do after learning the truth." I looked again at Margaret's folded letter. For years, I had thought silence was part of protecting him. Maybe it had been when he was 21. I wasn't sure it still was. Claire wiped at one eye. "Thomas, I'm sorry." I turned toward her. "I mean it," she said. "What I said was awful. I was stressed about tonight, about the wedding, about both families meeting properly. I wanted everything to be perfect, and I handled this terribly." Her mother nodded slightly, as if encouraging her to continue. Claire looked toward the empty chair. "Please sit down. We can start over. We're supposed to be celebrating." For a second, that sounded reasonable. I was tired of being the reason nobody had touched dinner. I wanted to put the papers back into the envelope, tell Daniel we would discuss his proposal privately, and let the evening become what it was supposed to be. I even reached toward the chair. Then Claire continued. "I never meant to insult you personally. I was only worried about how it would look." My hand stopped on the chair back. Daniel's expression changed. "How what would look?" Claire seemed to realize too late that she had stepped back into the same hole. "Daniel, you know what I mean. This venue, the wedding, our families, people notice things. Things like my father being a farmer? That's not what I'm saying." "Then say what you were saying." She looked at me, then at her parents. "I just wanted tonight to feel polished. That's all." Nobody rushed to rescue her this time. The apology had sounded like a door closing on the conflict, but those few words opened it again. The problem wasn't that Claire had mistaken me for someone wealthy enough to deserve respect. The problem was that she still seemed to think respect depended on whether I fit the picture she wanted other people to see. Daniel stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached beside his plate, picked up the small card on which he had written his engagement toast, and quietly folded it in half. Daniel set the folded card beside his plate. Claire stared at it. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not giving the toast I wrote." "Daniel, this is getting completely out of proportion." "Is it?" "Yes." Her voice tightened. "I said something cruel. I apologized. Are we seriously going to let one sentence ruin our engagement dinner?" Daniel glanced at me before answering. "I don't think this is about one sentence anymore." Claire pushed her chair back slightly. "Then what is it about?" I knew what he was thinking before he said it. I had heard the smaller comments too. I had simply chosen not to collect them into a case against her. Daniel mentioned the wedding venue question first, then the suggestion that he buy me something more presentable. Claire shook her head. Those weren't insults. Maybe not by themselves. Because they weren't. Daniel turned toward me. "Dad, were there others?" That was the question I had hoped he wouldn't ask. I could have ended the conversation with one word. No. I could have told him Claire had been nervous, that weddings made people foolish, that none of it mattered. Daniel might have accepted that because I had spent most of his life making difficult things sound manageable. But if I protected him now, I would be helping him walk into a marriage without information I already had. "A few," I said. Claire looked at me sharply. I kept my voice calm. Nothing I thought was worth bringing to Daniel. Questions about whether I'd be comfortable around certain people, whether I owned anything appropriate for certain occasions. Things like that. Thomas, I was trying to help. I know you may have thought you were. Daniel looked down at the folded toast card. I hated the hurt on his face. This was exactly why I had stayed quiet. Son, don't make your decision because of me. He looked up. How can this not be about you? Because you're the one marrying her. I can tell you what happened. I can't tell you what to do with it. Claire's eyes filled again. So what? The wedding gets canceled because I cared too much about appearances? Nobody said canceled, Daniel replied. But you're thinking it. I'm thinking about what those appearances mean to you. Claire looked around the table, but even her parents remained silent. Finally, she said, You don't understand. I always thought you wanted something different from the way you grew up. Daniel's face went still. Different how? Claire hesitated. There was still time for her to stop. You worked so hard, she said. You built this career, this life. I thought you were proud that you'd moved beyond all that. Daniel glanced at me. Beyond what? Claire swallowed. The farm. Struggling. Having to worry about every expense. I thought that was something you escaped. That word did more damage than the first one. Escaped. As though the fields where his mother had packed his lunches, the kitchen where we had counted tuition money, and the work that had kept our family standing were things Daniel should be grateful to have left behind. I didn't need anyone at the table to defend me anymore. I understood the problem clearly. So did Daniel. Claire reached across the space between them. I didn't mean your father is something to be ashamed of. Daniel looked at her hand for a moment. Then he took it. Relief crossed her face too quickly. He held her hand gently, but his expression did not soften. Claire, he said, I love you. Her eyes closed briefly. I love you too. That's why I need to know whether loving you means spending the rest of my life pretending the people who got me here are part of a life I was supposed to escape. Daniel's question stayed between them. Claire didn't pull her hand away, but the relief that had crossed her face disappeared. No, she said. That isn't what I want. Then help me understand what you do want. Her voice dropped. I wanted us to have a good life. So do I. A stable life. One where we don't have to worry the way your parents did. There's nothing wrong with wanting that. Daniel glanced at me, then back at her. But Dad is still going to be my father if we have more money than he did. The farm is still where I grew up. Those things don't become embarrassing because my paycheck changed. Claire looked down at their joined hands. I know that. Do you? He wasn't cruel when he asked it. Because tonight was one dinner. What happens at Christmas? What happens if Dad comes to visit us wearing the same kind of shirt he wore tonight? What happens if we have children someday, and he shows up at their school in that old truck? I almost interrupted at that. My truck had suddenly taken on more symbolic importance than it deserved. But Daniel wasn't talking about the truck. Claire understood that too. Would you worry about how that looked? He asked. Her silence lasted long enough to answer him. Then she shook her head. I don't want to be that person. That's not the same as not being that person. Claire winced, but she nodded. For the first time that evening, she didn't explain what she had meant. She didn't blame stress or seating arrangements or the pressure of making everything perfect. I looked at Thomas and decided what kind of man he was from what he had, she said. Then I treated him like having him beside me would lower how people saw us. She turned toward me. I'm sorry. Not because you turned out to have done something extraordinary for Daniel. I should have been willing to sit beside you if none of these papers existed. That mattered more than the first apology. It didn't erase anything, but at least it named what had actually happened. Thank you for saying it plainly, I told her. Claire looked back at Daniel. What happens now? He released her hand slowly. I don't know. Her face changed. Daniel, I'm not ending our engagement at this table. I saw her breathe again. But I'm not pretending we can go back to planning the wedding tomorrow either. You want to postpone it? I want to pause the planning. Claire's mother shifted in her chair, but said nothing. Daniel continued. I love you. That's why I'm not making a permanent decision while we're both upset. But before I marry you, I need to know whether tonight was the ugliest version of a mistake you understand now, or whether this is how you actually see my family when nobody fits the picture you want. Claire wiped her cheek. How am I supposed to prove that? I don't think you prove it tonight. That was the right answer. Trust rebuilt too quickly usually meant someone wanted relief more than repair. Claire turned to me again. Thomas, I am sorry I decided what you were worth before I knew anything about you. I nodded. I accept the apology. Her expression lifted slightly. But accepting it isn't the same as knowing what comes next. She nodded again. this time without arguing. Daniel gathered the papers and placed Margaret's letter carefully on top. Looking at them, I finally understood why that envelope had mattered before Claire ever moved a place card. Daniel had brought it because he had discovered where part of his life had come from, and he wanted to acknowledge a burden Margaret and I had tried to keep invisible. Claire's insult had not made those papers valuable. It had made their meaning impossible to ignore. I picked up my jacket. I think that's enough for tonight. Daniel started gathering the envelope. Dad, take this with you. I shook my head. You brought it because there was something you needed to say. We said enough for one evening. I touched his shoulder as I passed him. Bring it when we talk. Then I looked at Claire. She didn't ask me to stay this time. She simply moved aside and let me leave with my dignity instead of trying to repair the evening for an audience. Behind me, Daniel placed the papers back inside the envelope and carried it with him. The wedding plan stayed paused for the next several weeks. Daniel and Claire didn't make announcements or turn what happened into a family spectacle. They simply stopped moving forward while they figured out whether they still wanted to move forward together. Claire didn't call me the next morning asking me to forgive her again. I appreciated that. When she finally did contact me, she asked one question. Would it be all right if I came to the farm sometime? I thought about it before saying yes. A few days later, she arrived without Daniel. I didn't give her a tour designed to prove anything. There wasn't anything to prove. I showed her the equipment shed because she asked about it. We walked past the section of irrigation line I had repaired the afternoon of the engagement dinner. She saw the farmhouse, the machinery that had been repaired more times than replaced, and the fields that looked ordinary unless you knew how much work went into keeping them productive. Inside, she noticed Margaret's small desk near the kitchen, where we had kept bills, school papers, farm records, and nearly everything else that mattered enough not to lose. So this is where you made those decisions? She asked. Most of them. She ran her fingers lightly along the back of the chair, but didn't turn the moment into another apology. That helped. Claire had come expecting, I think, to understand the sacrifice behind Daniel's life. What she discovered instead was simpler. I was exactly what I had appeared to be at dinner. I was a farmer with a modest house, aging equipment, an old truck, and bills that required attention. There was no hidden fortune beneath the fields. No secret version of me that made her original judgment wrong. The judgment had been wrong before she knew anything else. Daniel and I had our own conversation about the envelope. I still refused to call his proposal repayment. Eventually, we reached an agreement I could live with. He would contribute toward part of the remaining farm obligation and help with equipment when it genuinely made sense, not because he owed me for being his father, but because he was an adult choosing to share responsibility with family. Margaret might have argued with both of us before eventually making coffee and declaring the discussion finished. I liked imagining that. Claire and Daniel kept seeing each other. They talked more seriously than they had before, according to Daniel, and less about venues, guest lists, and appearances. I didn't ask when the wedding planning would resume. That decision belonged to them, and I meant what I had said at dinner. I could give Daniel the truth, but I couldn't choose his marriage for him. A few weeks after Claire visited the farm, Daniel invited me to a small family meal. Nothing formal. No private room. No place cards. No speeches waiting beside the plates. When I arrived, Claire was already there. She looked nervous when she saw me, but she didn't rush over with another apology. Instead, as everyone began finding a place at the table, she put her hand on the back of the chair beside her and pulled it out. For half a second, I remembered the engagement dinner, the moved place card, the empty chair, and the sentence that had stopped the room. Claire looked at me. Is this seat taken? I could have made her work harder for the answer. Maybe part of me once would have wanted to. But accountability was never supposed to become humiliation traveling in the opposite direction. Not anymore, I said. I sat down beside her. Daniel caught my eye from across the table. He didn't smile broadly or make anything of it. He didn't need to. The wedding was still theirs to decide. The apology was still something Claire would have to live out rather than repeat. And trust, once damaged, would take longer than one meal to rebuild. But the chair beside her was no longer something she was trying to escape. This time, she had saved it for me.